Windhorse is our innate ability to uplift ourselves and our environment by giving rise to a positive energy that is both relaxed and disciplined. Since 1981, Windhorse Community Services has integrated this understanding with modern conventional therapies, meditation, and contemplative traditions in the development of at-home, whole-person mental health recovery. Windhorse Journal is dedicated to the mission of communicating decades of clinical and personal experience to professionals, educators, students, and anyone seeking recovery options. Please join the dialogue.
Welcome to Windhorse Journal Entry 063, The Space Between, Opening Ourselves to Inclusion. Part 1 of a conversation moderated by Chuck Knapp, with participants Sorin Thomas, Marie DiGiacomo, and Polly Banerjee Gallagher. This conversation explores identity, fear, and marginalization within our community and society at large. The group discusses the complexities of inclusivity through the lens of a contemplative approach to mental health, the binaries we often find ourselves trapped within, and approaching it all with compassion and bravery. Let's listen now to Windhorse Journal Entry 063, The Space Between, Opening Ourselves to Inclusion.
Welcome everyone to the Windhorse Journal, and I'm your host, Chuck Knapp. We're so pleased to be presenting today's podcast, which will be a discussion focused around the territory of inclusivity. Our three guests for this conversation are people who bring thoughtful perspectives as well as broad experience to this topic: Sorin Thomas, Polly Banerjee Gallagher, and Marie DiGiacomo. Welcome, thank you for being here. And would you please introduce yourselves and share what you think would be useful for people to know about you? Sorin, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So my name is Sorin Thomas. I am queer and transgender and use pronouns they, their, them. I'm a licensed professional counselor and a licensed addictions counselor. Was trained at Naropa University and am now working in the field as a counselor and found newly found passion as an educator. And so I'm here in both of those capacities today. And I wanted to start off by sharing a little bit about myself and my journey and why this worked for me. So one of the things about me is that I'm a US citizen, I'm white, and I grew up in Europe, primarily in Spain. And I say this because I had one of my earliest experiences was as a third culture kid, someone who occupies the middle section of a Venn diagram between two cultures. And that's a unique experience for me that really shaped who I am and was an entry point into my understanding of non-binary thinking and just diversity in general. And then the next part of my experience where this became salient is as I came out with regards to my sexuality and my gender, really living as a bridge person between heteronormative culture, which we'll talk about more, and queer culture. And just by virtue of who I am, really captured my curiosity and excitement about bridging two worlds and acknowledging and finding safety in sameness and also celebrating and seeking out difference.
Thank you, Sorin. Polly, do you want to?
Sure. Thanks, Chuck, and thanks, Sorin, for that. My name is Polly Banerjee Gallagher, and currently I am the Director of Windhorse Community Services. And I've been with Windhorse for a number of years now, over 20. And a little bit about my journey is I was born in Burma, and I've been in the United States since I was 10 years old. But I am Indian, pretty much 100%. Both of my parents are Bengali. So in that way, English is my third language. When I was born, Burmese was my mother tongue. And then at home, we spoke Bengali and then learned English when I was 10 years old and went through the school system here, obviously, in the United States, but have had a lot of opportunities to be able to travel and still come back, to the bases here. And I think that for me, I've become more and more aware of just the differences that we have with one another, and how sometimes we don't acknowledge that. So I've been pretty passionate about trying to understand that in the context of my work at Windhorse, wanting to get to know each other much better from that perspective. And Marie?
Thanks, Polly. Thanks, Sorin. And always thanks, Chuck. Well, my name is Marie DiGiacomo, and I use the pronouns they, them at this point in my life. That wasn't always the case. I identify within the LGBT, queer, and transgender world specifically, and it's evolved over time, but I do identify as a lesbian. And at this point in my life, I have become very interested in understanding what it means to live between the binaries, the space between. I've been with Windhorse for 25 years and have held various positions within the organization. Myself and Chuck and Jamie Emery have recently retired as former co-directors. We're currently holding the position of chairs. And I have always been, I'm a social worker. I was trained as a social worker, and I've always been very interested in how difference intersects, what it looks like, and how it brings great joy and enrichment, certainly into my life, and also sort of the heartbreak of it as well. And so my hope in doing the podcast together and us starting to explore this material of what is inclusivity, how do we live it, how do we expand it, is very exciting to me. Because of my generation and my age, coming out was not a simple matter. And it took me a long time being raised in a white ethnic working class world that also included Catholicism. So lesbian was not exactly talked about in some kind of casual or ordinary way. So to say the least, it's been a journey, and we'll keep going. So here we are. Thank you.
Thank you all. We've been working on pulling an inclusivity podcast together for some time now. So I'm just really thrilled to be here in the midst of this happening. As a place to start, Sorin, do you want to give us a little bit of overview from which to begin our discussion?
Sure. So I thought I would start by sharing a little bit more about why this is important to me and the responses that I've received from other individuals with whom I've been in contact and trained, why this information has been important to them. My observation has been that the majority of people that I come in contact with are folks who really have recognized that there is a problem in our culture and our society, the way that we treat people. Systemic privilege and oppression are extremely harmful, and are wondering how they can be a part of the solution. And I think one of the things that gets in the way is, for sure, our fear, the complexity and our defensive-ness, shame. So our culture has historically not handled issues of difference very well. And we have a lot of healing to do, all of us together. So namely, I would say there's a lot of strong emotions that get in the way of action. And lots of those are well-intentioned. Fear of hurting somebody can keep us from engaging, which unfortunately only perpetuates a toxic system that we have in place. Mm-hmm. So one of our intentions that we discussed as a group is to really do our part, if at all possible, to share the messiness of these conversations and to encourage people to engage and get excited and want to engage and learn some tools, maybe how to make mistakes and recover, so that we can have more of these conversations. The other thing that I've experienced that gets in the way is some old learning, and particularly in my work teaching about gender and sexuality specifically, there's just old learning about, what is gender, what is sexuality, how do those present, how do those show up, but we're going to trace it all the way back to binary thinking in general, quite literally black and white thinking, and how that's problematic, and also linear thinking. And so my hope is here that there'll be a potential for new learning, unlearning and relearning about the complexity of human beings and how we can all fit together and what each of our roles can be for the growth and the health and wellness of this culture.
That was a really lovely overview and aspiration. And you named something in particular, I think, that would be important to start with talking a little bit more about, which is fear. And obviously conversations are one of the ways that people can learn from each other and start to make movement, the kind of movement you were just talking about. I'm wondering what y'all might have to say about how we can think about working with fear differently so that we can create environments where we learn from each other.
Wow, it's such a rich topic, this topic of fear. It's hard to kind of encapsulate it in relationship to dialogue. I think for me, there's been some conversation of like, how do we approach this kind of a dialogue where we feel comfortable or safe to be able to talk? And I think that premise in and of itself is where maybe my expectation isn't going to quite be met, because I think, I think you were saying, Sorin, about it's not always, it can be messy, it can be difficult to kind of name. And then also there is this piece of learning, even learning the language. How do you refer to one another where it's not offensive? How do we honor one another in this way? And I think that there is a lot to be learned in that way. And I think the fear comes if we feel like there is a binary, right or wrong. If I say this thing, I'm going to be perceived as in such a way that I don't want to be perceived. So I'm wrong, and therefore I should just not say something or pretend like I'm right. So I think for me, if I can be just riding in between the right and wrong, it's always helpful, because when I'm in the position of wanting to learn, and then I'm open. I don't have to be either one of those things. So when you were talking, Sorin, I was thinking that it's just to stay open, that you can always learn something new. And in that way, it's hard to have the same level of fear, because the fear comes from a strong expectation of maybe how I think I should be in the world or how somebody else should be in the world. But what if I get really curious about how someone else is in the world, even if I don't really understand it fully? So for me, this aspect of fear melts away when we can just have an open dialogue. And that's why I'm excited about, just having this as an opportunity. Where are we each coming from? And yeah, I hope we can expand from that. What do you think, Anne-Marie?
I was contemplating this idea of what makes me afraid? What keeps me from really stepping into the landscape that you just presented, Polly, in terms of curiosity and openness. And I think as someone who identifies outside of the prominent paradigm in our culture of heteronormativity, one of the primary ways of seeing the world, my fear arises from a place of feeling invisible, feeling that I have to assimilate, conform, accommodate to the heteronormative culture, and that there's an expectation. I often feel that if I get too outside of that line, that it will make people uncomfortable, and then I can feel that uncomfortableness, and then the pullback happens, and this kind of just going along happens. And so how to feel that, be in that, allow it, know that it's going to happen, but not be afraid of it. I guess my learning and my own journey has been to really get comfortable with who I actually am and how I actually want to be. And when that edge happens, or I feel like there's some expectations for me to show up in a certain way, to meet it and to not be afraid. So that comes up for me. And another piece I can get afraid of is we're at a pivotal moment here in our world. And I have these moments of being fearful that we're going to turn away and that we're not going to stay with this. Just as you were describing, Polly, stay with that kind of possibility to really understand each other. And I get tight or anxious, like, will we turn away again? Will this keep going forward? And relaxing that and having the faith and confidence in us as human beings that we'll keep going. Sorin?
Yeah, I'm reminded of two things listening to you two speak. One is from horse training that I've done in my life. And the opposite of fear is curiosity. I feel like, Polly, that's what you were speaking to. And Anne-Marie, I was really thinking about the concept of fearlessness and how fearlessness, I remember learning about that when I was in undergrad at Naropa, and it was very impactful that it's not about turning away from the fear, disengaging, but about facing it and stepping into contact. And so personally, the way that I work with my own fear and the way that I have encouraged others to work with their fear is deep listening, to soaking in another person, giving of yourself, that beautiful feeling of the mutual vulnerability, feeling, confident that you have ways to repair when there are technical fouls in the relationship, that you have a way to forgive yourself, a way to apologize to another person, and relying on those. And just for me, the dangling carrot is how rich relationships can be when we engage with them, and how rich our experience of the world can be if we don't seclude ourselves to people who share the same identities and experiences and voices as us. But if we reach across and learn about all of the diversity and expansiveness, complexity that exists among humans. And I think everybody has to find their own motivation. For me, I'm such an extrovert, and I just love people. And so developing these skills and overcoming, moving through my own fear allows me access to the richness of human beings and human relationships. So tremendous motivation for me there.
I think one of the ways I experience you, Sorin, is this feeling of being welcomed to ask. If there's something I don't understand, there's some way that you have of talking. You have come to Windhorse Community Services, and you've helped us kind of understand a little more deeply how to work with, fear, mainly fear. And the main message I feel like I got from you is that all of it is welcome. You can ask questions, and I think that's where we get caught up, is if we don't think that we can't ask the questions to try to clarify for ourselves if something isn't quite making sense in the way that we make sense of the world. So I was thinking as you were speaking that you have such a way to put people at ease by making them feel welcome to like, go ahead and ask me about something. And I want to have that feeling too, where when it comes to, for instance, for race, if somebody asks me because they notice that, I'm not white, that I appreciate it, because I don't want people to try to put me in this box of like, what color am I? And that's it. But, there's like a multi-layer to each person. So when somebody asks or gets curious about where I come from or what it was like for me, it feels like, for me, I get more connected to my own ground, and I'm so happy to share. So I think that fear melts for me when we're able to share, like more kind of drop our defenses of what we might think is coming our way when we don't ask each other questions in that way. So from a race perspective too, I think that's been a similar thing for me of like, I want to get to know people too. I was just having this moment of appreciation for the way that it can feel so welcoming.
What I'm getting as you all are talking is that fear is actually workable. Fear is part of the experience. It's natural and it's workable. But curiosity and having some fearlessness or courage to go into it those are two pretty important things there. And the richness, once you can get through that, there's a lot of richness to just having contact with another human being who may have a different view of things and a different experience of things. And that's a pretty cool thing when you can actually meet with another person that way.
You know, and I think we also have to understand that it takes time for people to be willing to even want to acknowledge their fear. Mm-hmm. And this idea of a big meadow where it takes time. You know, at Windhorse, we started this dialogue to look at anti-racism, to look at inclusion. And one of the things that we've been talking about is not just to feel safe together, but to be brave together. And my own experience of working with people's fears, my own fears, is just that there's a sense that we have to give it time to feel some basic safety, but also out of that safety, this sense of being brave and knowing that our fears can be held within the environment. And we're learning about that now together at Windhorse, and people are taking more chances and sharing more of what feels scary, basically, in terms of just exposing themselves. Because, you know, that's the thing. In order to get at some of these things that we're talking about, we have to be willing to expose ourselves and our anxieties, our fears, our sense of not being accepted, our being invisible, all of that. So,
and you know, Anne-Marie, I was thinking in that way, it's okay to feel uncomfortable. You know, that's not the goal. Is for us all to feel aligned and comfortable, because where we really get to know each other and ourselves is in our discomfort. So to me, when I can express my discomfort, that's when I feel like I'm safe, that I'm safe with this group of people. I trust you. So I'm going to let myself be vulnerable and be uncomfortable and let you see me in that. So I think the dialogue that you were referring to, Anne-Marie, is helping us get there. You know.
For sure.
And I'd just like to add to that in my experience, a small dose of fear or apprehension or caution is extremely healthy, especially considering how much personal and systemic wounding exists in our culture. So the fear keeps us alert and awake to being mindful of how we impact each other. That's so important and precious. But then an unhealthy amount of fear, which we can sometimes overdose ourselves with our own fear, really stops activity, stops engagement. And like I was saying before, with an unhealthy dose of fear or anxiety, those of us with privileged identities or operating out of our privileged identities can stop engaging. So a healthy dose of fear is what keeps us active and alert. And, an unhealthy dose is what can really prevent us from engaging and furthering the conversations, interrupting systemic oppression. And when we, especially those of us who have privileged identities, or when we're acting out of our privileged identities, do not act, our fear holds us back, and essentially that's a vote for let's keep this system going the way that it's going, which in my opinion is a very toxic system and needs us all to be actively engaged to make a change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it feels like we're just kind of touching the tip of a bunch of different topics that lead us to, I think, a term that was used earlier, and it was named briefly in the previous podcast, which was an inclusivity panel from the 2019 Windhorse conference. But the term non-binary was used in there, and it's been used a couple times in here. And as I understand it, that's very accurate to how to understand moving from current kinds of relational and organizational forms to something that actually embodies inclusivity. And I wonder if one of you would please pick up this term and get us started kind of thinking about binary and non-binary.
So one of the false premises that we rest so much of our learning on is that human condition can be divided into two categories. Every aspect of who we are is divided into two categories. And so that's, male, female, white, person of color, differently abled and able-bodied. And then all of these things, unfortunately, then come together and have created a story that we tell ourselves about a right way to be human and be in relationship and exist in the world, and a wrong way to be human and in relationship and exist in the world. And then furthermore, those things that we tell us have then taken root in a system that now privileges the right ways, supposed ways of being, and oppresses the wrong, supposed wrong ways of being. And so really at its core, binary thinking is just the way that we arbitrarily divide people into two categories, and unfortunately making one category right and one category wrong.
And that's really resonant with a contemplative view as well.
From a contemplative point of view, there's the binary of relative and absolute, but what's happening on a relative level of day-to-day things as they are, that includes all of what Sorin's talking about, depending on where you are, where your culture is, and how things look. And the absolute notion is really also what Sorin was talking about, which that kind of idea can transmute or transform into this notion that the binaries are illusory. They really actually don't exist. And when we live, we really live, I like to use the phrase, the space between the binaries. That's more of how existence really plays out. Mm-hmm. But it's stunning the degree to which the binaries exist in our day-to-day lives. And many of the binaries have created systems of oppression that have harmed. So I think part of really trying to look at non-binary thinking is also having to step into naming and revealing and unpacking the binaries and the impact they have on us. Personally, within our relationships and communities and the organizations we live in, and structural and systemic racism are absolutely grounded in the binaries. And so, again, having these kinds of conversations that let us really look into this on all levels.
Yeah, it seems like that's the challenge for us, as individuals and as a culture, as a society, is to actually be okay with the gray, that it doesn't always have to be this way or that way. So, yeah, I find that to be really interesting. I feel like sometimes I struggle a bit with that too, especially when it comes to gender. And I've shared this with you before, where it almost like, for me, I want to identify very strongly with the gender of being female as a reaction to all the male dominance I feel in my world. So then I think that's sometimes I feel more the pain of it, because maybe I'm missing the non-binary aspect of it. It's like I have to establish myself as in this feminine gender as a way to say I'm actually okay, because for so long I felt like the message has been, whether overtly or not so openly, that it's not okay. So I really appreciate this dialogue, because I feel like I have a lot to learn about that when it comes to how do you really manifest that. I can really hear it and I really resonate with it. And at the same time, when we live in this world where, as a woman in the world, it is very difficult. So I can imagine, as a person who doesn't want to be identified with either gender, how much more difficult that would be. because then it's like, it's hard enough to feel like the non-dominant gender. So anyway, I'm just appreciating that, what you're both saying, and just curious about what that experience is like in the world for you when you're really trying to not necessarily be pigeonholed into either gender in that way.
Well, it's interesting, Polly, because, I obviously identify as a female, but I also identify in terms of my preference and love of women. And that has its own binary. And I feel like what I've learned over time, especially in terms of looking at this notion of transgender, going beyond just, oh, is this my preference only? Over time, I've come to understand that I can open up to many things, and not just this notion, as a lesbian, it looks like this. As a lesbian, it could look like a lot of things, or I don't even have to use that identity necessarily either. That to me is the wisdom of non-binary and the wisdom of looking at what exists in the in-between. And that wasn't always an awareness for me. And it happened in a very unexpected and surprising way. So I'm very grateful to be able to understand that about myself.
So in the conversation about binary, non-binary, and really all through what we've been talking about so far, there are so many different areas that marginalization can occur. And we all work in the mental health field, and we've had a lot of experience personally as well as working with others. So one of the most significant areas of marginalization we work with in the mental health field is around what are acceptable states of mind and what aren't. We know that in Western developed societies, what's normal tends to be a very narrow, limited kind of band of experience. And we know this in itself is a particularly pernicious kind of othering, and especially when you combine it with other kinds of marginalization, this gets very compounded. And I'd really love to hear you all say something about your experience in this way.
That's a really a good one to contemplate, I think, just to get a really deeper understanding of how this impacts all of us. The one way that I really appreciate from the Windhorse contemplative aspect is that the way we work with our minds, it's not, we're not binary at all. Like when it comes to that, it's not like I'm well, somebody else is not. There's such a spectrum. Anybody is capable of having extreme states of mind. We all do. For instance, during right before my period, you can talk to my husband. I definitely have some extreme states of mind where I recognize what's happening for me. But at the same time, I don't always have control over it. So if I have people around me who understand, and that's not to minimize what people go through when there are some really extreme states when it comes to schizophrenia, bipolar. But what I'm trying to do is find this entry point of, we all experience, grief. Grief is an extreme state of mind as well. So in that way, I think the marginalization happens when somebody has had a diagnosis, whether it is schizophrenia or bipolar or depression or anxiety, that it becomes this solidified label. You have something wrong with you. This is a stamp, and this is what you have to live with. And the only way out of that is medication or isolation or institution. And I think that's where the marginalization becomes just a heavy burden. Whereas I think our view and perspective is we look at our own states of mind in order to be able to relate and say that it's really a wide range that we can go through. Somebody who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia, for instance, has the most brilliant moments, capacity to have all of the aspects of the mind that I have too, and vice versa. And so I think that for me, the marginalization aspect has to do with when we decide that somebody is solidly this, that this is the mental health label. And then the person accepts it. The person who's being put the label on is like, thinks, oh yeah, this is who I am, and I have to kind of function from there. Whereas there's such a bigger range to all of us. So anyway, I think that's one of the ways that I have really appreciated what we call mutual recovery in Windhorse, is really seeing the capacity of my own mind, that any of this can happen, so that when I see a client, I don't feel this other with them as much, because there's not like, I'm here and I'm going to solve this problem for you and fix it. We really try to approach it from the perspective of, what can I learn here? This person has a lot to teach as well. So what's your experience like, Sorin, in this way?
Sure. So one of the things that I was thinking about is that, unfortunately, because of our fear of difference and the way that we relate to difference, we have pathologized folks who are different, in terms of their identity, in terms of their experience in the world. And I so appreciate you acknowledging the strengths of Windhorse Community Services and all the individuals who are a part of this community, because I think that what's so valuable is being able to use those strengths of ours to develop new skills. And one of the ways I see that most clearly with regards to mental health is if we have this practice in our own way, whatever it might be, of recognizing the both and of an individual, the suffering and the brilliance, and seeing ourselves reflected in the other person. I experience extreme states too. If we can do all of those things, then we can reach the same way across race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, which is to say that we all have race, we all have ethnicity, we all have genders and sexualities, and that these ways in which we pathologize difference are really just the toxicity of our own minds, and it's just not true. And we have these very harmful stereotypes about groups of people who are dangerous, who are lazy, who are greedy, who are inappropriate for children. These are all stereotypes about different groups of people. But if we can begin to reach past that and see, the both and in everything, we're much more able to treat people like we want to be treated. And so, I think one of the saddest things for me in my life is experiencing myself pathology put on me as a trans person, gender dysphoria, and the whole story, and then looking at my own history as a queer person of pathologizing queer people and sexuality. And there's just a very long history of that. We're getting better, but I think that combining these two things is a real strength, in fact, for those of us in the Windhorse community.
I think Windhorse, over the years, the Windhorse Approach and the Windhorse projects, our deepest strength has been in this area of really wanting to look at how stigma creates such suffering for people and all the mechanisms put in place that create that, and for us to not replicate that. And our practice of basic attendance really, I think, speaks to a lot of what Polly was talking about, in the sense that meeting people where they are, seeing ourselves and others, knowing that our own mind states move around from places of basic tranquility to deep extremes. In my own life, I've gone through the loss of my wife and different family members, and it's absolutely true, Polly, that grief moves you into some pretty extreme and scary places that you would not have anticipated at all. And if it weren't for me personally, my work in the community at Windhorse, my friends and family, I don't know if I would have ever gotten off the couch or figured out how to come back in. So here we are with this beautiful practice of basic attendance, and really having the opportunity through that kind of awareness, being present with people as they are. Just as Polly was talking about, it allows us to see our own mutual recovery. I think that's our gift. That's been our gift over the decades. And from where I sit and have sat, I so appreciate the marginalization that we've tried to unpack around mental health, and there's more to do around other aspects of marginalization, related to race and gender and the whole piece. So we can take this practice of basic attendance and apply it further and look at how we can really create the greatest level of inclusion. It's on a spectrum. So we can keep brightening up our spectrum and bringing more and more awareness to how marginalization works on all levels.
There was a lot of experience reflected in how destructive the othering is around people's mental health, and what are acceptable states of mind and what aren't acceptable states of mind. And there's another level of this, I think, that we want to just touch on here, which is how accessible are services for people in marginalized positions, and how are we working with that? And Sorin, you have an agency that you founded, so just if you could all say a little something about that, please.
Yeah. Well, Chuck, I think that is a kind of a multi-layered question as well, because I think that from Windhorse Community Services perspective, if I needed services right now, I wouldn't be able to afford Windhorse Community Services, because it really isn't that attainable to have any kind of a substantial team. So as the director, I'm admitting this because this is one of the challenges and dilemma that I feel like I think about all the time in collaboration with my colleagues and with admissions, is how do we make it more accessible? Because we work in such a team heavy constellation at times. So in order to be able to afford something like that, it's really prohibitive for a number of people. So what we have done to try to address that is to be able to have flexibility of teams, to be able to tailor something to someone. Can we do a smaller team where it might be attainable? And then really trying to help people stretch resources. And then, we're looking at starting this psychotherapy services where we can maybe reach more people in the community to be able to provide psychotherapy from a contemplative basis that we offer that is unique. So I think from our own personal perspective, it's a challenge and a dilemma, and we grapple with it, we work with it. And the other thing we try to do is try to provide as much resources as possible to people to be able to look around at other places and share our view as well, right? And then there's also just the stigma of looking for mental health care for people. I think that when it comes to people of color, there's already a stigma. So I think that there's a hesitation to seek help, because then it feels like a compounded stigma that comes along. And there's some services that are available that people feel aren't quite adequate to be able to meet what is needed in situations. So I think, Chuck, it's a question that I think a lot about and wonder how we can do better and better to be able to help, besides the trying to tailor to someone's needs in as best a way as possible. So I think that this is something that we continue to talk about in our organization. And I also look to other organizations to see what is it they're doing, to be able to make it happen. Because it's really trying to figure out how to have the infrastructure as well that we need to serve. So it's this kind of line, that the balance that we try to strike that doesn't always seem to, in my opinion, be able to serve in the way that I think that we would love to do. Right. So, I wonder what it's like for you, Sorin, with the nonprofit, how you work with that.
Yeah, what I'm thinking right now is just that, to answer your question, Chuck, no, adequate services are not accessible to folks with marginalized identities, and especially, multiple intersecting marginalized identities. That's a major crisis facing our nation. So this economic structure, business structure is set up in this country that nonprofits and other quality organizations do step up and try to make a difference and a change and do what they can. But unfortunately, the larger systems are so discriminatory and unsafe to most people that it's just a huge crisis that we're facing right now. Just thinking about, the simple fact of having a client who is in an emergency situation, suicidality, psychosis, and the question that we have to ask ourselves is it safe to call the police? Is it safe to take this person to a hospital? Is this safe to introduce the systems that are in place to protect people, but we know do not protect all people, and we have to balance that out. So like I said, I think there's a lot of quality organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, who are doing their part to make services more accessible. But also, there's a lot to be said for large-scale policy and cultural change that's needed, because we're small compared to the police department, the medical systems. We're small organizations.
Windhorse Journal is a publication of Windhorse Community Services, supporting recovery from mental health challenges at home and in the community since 1981.